The interstate stretched endlessly ahead like a gray ribbon, cutting through the October landscape of southern Ohio. Frank Morrison gripped the steering wheel of his weathered Ford F-150 with calloused hands that bore the scars of 35 years as an electrician. At 62, his hair had turned completely silver, and the lines around his blue eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights since his wife Margaret had passed 2 years ago. The GPS on his dashboard showed 712 miles remaining to Austin, Texas, 12 hours and 43 minutes, according to the mechanical voice that had been his only companion since leaving his house in Millerville at 4 a.m. He'd driven through Cincinnati as the sun was rising, painting the Ohio River in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of Margaret's hair when they were young. Frank reached for the thermos of black coffee on the passenger seat. Margaret always said he made it strong enough to wake the dead. The thought brought a bitter smile to his lips. She'd been the one who kept the family together, the bridge between him and their daughter Sarah. Without her, that bridge had crumbled to dust. The last real conversation he'd had with Sarah was at Margaret's funeral. Even then, it had been strained, formal. She'd flown in from Texas wearing a black dress he'd never seen before, her dark hair so much like her mother's, pulled back in a severe bun. They'd hugged briefly at the graveside, but it felt like embracing a stranger. "I'm sorry for your loss, Dad," she'd said, the words careful and distant. "She was your mother, too," he'd replied, and immediately regretted the harshness in his voice. Sarah had left the day after the funeral without saying goodbye. That was 18 months ago. Since then, their communication had been reduced to brief, obligatory phone calls on holidays and birthdays. "How's work?" "Fine." "How's the weather?" "Hot." "Tell me about your life." Not much to tell. The conversations lasted maybe 5 minutes before one of them found an excuse to hang up. But 3 weeks ago, something had changed. Sarah had called him, actually called him, not just texted. Her voice sounded different. Excited, nervous, maybe a little scared. "Dad, I bought a house," she'd said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's in Austin, in this really nice neighborhood called Tarrytown. I know it's crazy, buying alone, but I got a promotion at work, and the market was good and—" "That's wonderful, honey," Frank had interrupted, meaning it. "I'm proud of you." There had been a pause, and he could hear something in the background. Voices, maybe music. "Dad, there's something else. Something I need to tell you, but not over the phone. Maybe you could come visit, see the house?" Frank's heart had skipped. Sarah inviting him to visit was unprecedented. In the 5 years since she'd moved to Texas for work, he'd never been to any of her apartments. She'd always made excuses when he'd suggested visiting. She was too busy. The place was too small. It wasn't a good time. "I'd love to see your new house," he'd said. "Okay, good. But Dad—" Her voice had dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "Don't tell the neighbors you're my father, okay? Just say you're a family friend if anyone asks." The words had hit him like a physical blow. "What? Why would you—" "I'll explain when you get here. Please, Dad. It's important." Before he could respond, she'd given him the address and hung up. For 3 weeks, those words had echoed in his mind. "Don't tell the neighbors you're my father." What kind of life was his daughter living that she was ashamed to acknowledge him? What had he done that was so terrible she couldn't even admit their relationship to strangers? Frank knew he hadn't been a perfect father. He'd worked long hours, missed some school plays and soccer games. He'd been raised by a man who believed children should be seen and not heard, and sometimes that old-fashioned sternness had crept into his own parenting. But he'd provided for his family, loved them in his own way, tried to teach Sarah right from wrong. Margaret had always been the one to explain his silences to Sarah, to translate his gruff affection into words a little girl could understand. "Your father loves you more than anything," she'd tell Sarah. "He just doesn't know how to say it." Maybe that was the problem. Maybe he'd never learned how to say it. The Ohio countryside gave way to Kentucky, then Tennessee. Frank stopped for gas and a sandwich in Nashville, watching families with children pump gas into SUVs with soccer ball stickers and honor student decals. He tried to remember being that kind of father, but the memories felt fuzzy, incomplete. He did remember the day Sarah left for college at UT Austin. She'd been 18, full of dreams and ambition, ready to conquer the world. Frank had wanted to tell her how proud he was, how much he'd miss her, how scared he was to let her go. Instead, he'd handed her an envelope with $500 cash and said, "Call if you need anything." Margaret had cried during the 3-hour drive home. Frank had kept his eyes on the road, his emotions locked away where they couldn't hurt anyone. Now, as he crossed into Arkansas in the late afternoon, Frank wondered if this trip was a mistake. Maybe Sarah didn't really want him there. Maybe the invitation had been an impulse she regretted. Maybe he should turn around and drive home to his empty house with its silence and memories, but he couldn't. Something in her voice during that phone call, a vulnerability he hadn't heard since she was small, kept him moving south. She'd said she needed to tell him something, and for the first time in years, she'd asked for him specifically. The sun was setting as he entered Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to stretch forever. Everything here was bigger than Ohio. The sky, the highways, the distances between towns. It felt like driving into another country. Austin's skyline appeared in the distance as darkness fell, a cluster of lights and tall buildings that looked nothing like the small towns Frank was used to. The GPS guided him through streets with names like South Lamar and Barton Springs Road, past restaurants and bars with people sitting on patios, laughing and talking under string lights. Tarrytown turned out to be exactly what Sarah had described, a nice neighborhood with tree-lined streets and well-maintained houses. The address led him to a charming bungalow with a wraparound porch and a small front yard that someone had carefully landscaped. Warm light glowed through the windows, and Frank could see moving figures inside. He parked across the street and sat in his truck for a moment, suddenly nervous. Through the front window he could see Sarah moving around what looked like a living room. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked happy, relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in years. Then another figure appeared in the window, a woman with short blonde hair, wearing a plaid shirt. Frank squinted, confused. The woman put her arms around Sarah from behind and kissed her neck. Frank's world tilted sideways. He sat frozen in his truck, watching his daughter embrace another woman with the kind of tenderness and intimacy he'd only ever seen between married couples. The pieces suddenly fell into place. Sarah's reluctance to let him visit, her request that he not tell the neighbors he was her father, the nervousness in her voice. His daughter was gay. Frank's first instinct was to start the truck and drive away, to pretend he'd never seen what he'd just witnessed. His second was to march up to the front door and demand an explanation. Instead, he sat paralyzed, his mind reeling with questions and emotions he couldn't name. How long had she been hiding this? Was this why she'd moved so far away? Was this the something she needed to tell him? Frank thought about his own childhood in rural Ohio, where certain things simply weren't discussed. He thought about the men he'd worked with over the years, their casual jokes and crude comments about people who were different. He thought about the church he and Margaret had attended, where the pastor spoke about traditional values and the sanctity of marriage between a man and woman. But mostly he thought about Sarah as a little girl, the way she'd run to him when he came home from work, how she'd sit on his lap while he read her bedtime stories, how proud she'd looked in her cap and gown at graduation. A tap on his passenger window made him jump. Sarah stood beside his truck, her face a mixture of joy and anxiety. Frank rolled down the window. "Dad! You made it! I was watching for you!" She paused, studying his face. Are you okay? You look pale. Frank cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. Just tired from the drive. Long way from Ohio. Come on, I'll help you with your bags. I'm so excited to show you the house. As Frank climbed out of the truck, he saw the blonde woman standing on the front porch, watching them with obvious nervousness. She was prettier than he'd first thought, with kind eyes and a genuine smile. Sarah followed his gaze. Dad, there's someone I want you to meet. They walked up the front path together, Frank carrying his overnight bag and feeling like he was walking to his own execution. The blonde woman stepped forward, extending her hand. You must be Frank. I'm Jessica Chen Williams. Sarah's told me so much about you. Frank shook her hand automatically, noting her firm grip and direct gaze. Nice to meet you, he managed. Sarah was wringing her hands, her eyes darting between Frank and Jessica. Dad, why don't you come in? I'll make some coffee. We can sit and talk. The house was beautiful inside. Hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, but Frank noticed they were all of Sarah and Jessica together, or Sarah alone. None included him. This is lovely, Frank said, meaning it. You've done well for yourself. Thanks. Jessica's an interior designer, so she helped with most of it. Frank nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Jessica was more than just a friend or roommate. They lived together, shared a life together. The realization hit him like a physical weight. Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Frank and Jessica standing awkwardly in the living room. Jessica cleared her throat. Mr. Morrison, I know this might be a surprise. Sarah's been wanting to tell you about us for a long time, but she wasn't sure how you'd react. How long? Frank asked quietly. We've been together 3 years, living together for 2. 3 years. His daughter had been in a serious relationship for 3 years, and he'd known nothing about it. She'd been sharing her life with someone, building a home, planning a future, and he'd been completely absent from all of it. Sarah returned with 3 mugs of coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set them on the coffee table. She sat on the couch next to Jessica, close enough that their knees touched. Dad, Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper, I know this isn't what you expected. I know it's not what you and Mom raised me to be. Frank looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. She was 33 years old, successful, clearly happy. She'd built a beautiful life for herself, and she was terrified of his reaction. Are you happy? He asked. Sarah blinked, obviously surprised by the question. What? Are you happy, Sarah? Does she make you happy? Sarah glanced at Jessica, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, Dad. Happier than I've ever been. Frank nodded slowly, processing. Then that's what matters. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Really? That's it? You're not angry? Frank set down his coffee mug and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Sarah, I've made a lot of mistakes as a father. I wasn't there when you needed me to be. I didn't know how to talk to you, how to show you that I loved you. Your mother was always better at that. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I may not understand everything about your life, but I understand that you're my daughter, and I love you. If Jessica makes you happy, then I'm grateful to her. Sarah burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. Jessica put an arm around her, glaring protectively at Frank as if he might change his mind. Honey, it's okay, Jessica murmured. It's okay. Frank felt helpless watching his daughter cry. He'd never been good with tears, never known the right thing to say or do. Margaret had always handled the emotional moments. Sarah, he said softly, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you felt like you couldn't tell me. I'm sorry you were scared of how I'd react. That's my fault, not yours. Sarah looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. I was so afraid you'd hate me, or disown me, or tell me I was going to hell." Frank's heart broke a little more. "Is that really what you think of me? I didn't know what to think. You never talked about stuff like this. And after Mom died, we barely talked at all." She was right, and they both knew it. Frank had retreated into himself after Margaret's death, letting grief and fear drive a wedge between him and the only family he had left. "Well," Frank said finally, "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Jessica spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Mr. Morrison, Sarah's been worried about this conversation for months. She loves you so much, and she was terrified of losing you." Frank looked at the two women sitting across from him, his daughter and the person she loved. They were holding hands now, united against whatever his reaction might be. "You're not going to lose me," he said firmly. "I've already lost too much. I'm not losing you, too." The evening that followed was awkward, but not unpleasant. Jessica made dinner, chicken and rice with vegetables that actually tasted good, not like the frozen dinners Frank had been living on. They talked about safe topics: Sarah's job at a tech company, Frank's retirement, the weather in Texas versus Ohio. Frank watched the way Sarah and Jessica moved around each other in the kitchen, the casual touches and shared glances that spoke of deep familiarity and affection. It was the same way he and Margaret had been after 30 years of marriage. When it was time for bed, Sarah showed him to the guest room, a small but comfortable space with its own bathroom and a view of the backyard. "Dad," she said, as he set his bag on the bed, "thank you for being, okay with this." Frank turned to face her. "Sarah, I want you to know something. I may need time to adjust, to understand all of this. But my love for you doesn't have conditions. It never has." Sarah hugged him then, really hugged him, for the first time since Margaret's funeral. Frank held his daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, the same brand she'd used since high school. "I love you too, Dad," she whispered. "I've missed you." After she left, Frank sat on the edge of the bed and called his best friend Bob back in Ohio. Bob answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Frank? What time is it? Where are you?" "I'm in Texas, at Sarah's house." "How's it going? She show you around the big city?" Frank hesitated. "Bob, what would you do if you found out something about your kid that you never expected? Something that changed everything you thought you knew about them?" Bob was quiet for a moment. "I'd love them anyway, Frank. That's what parents do. Even if it went against everything you were raised to believe? Especially then. Kids don't come with instruction manuals, buddy. We just have to figure it out as we go." After he hung up, Frank lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a house settling for the night. Through the thin walls, he could hear Sarah and Jessica talking quietly in their bedroom. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was loving, intimate. His daughter was gay. It was a fact he was still processing, still trying to understand. But Sarah was also successful, happy, loved, and loving. She'd built a life for herself that was full and rich and meaningful. Frank thought about Margaret, wishing she were there to help him navigate this new reality. She would have known exactly what to say, exactly how to make everyone feel comfortable and accepted. But Margaret was gone, and Frank was on his own. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out how to be the father Sarah needed him to be. Tonight, he was just grateful that his daughter had trusted him enough to let him into her world. Outside his window, Austin continued its evening rhythm, distant traffic, the occasional siren, the subtle sounds of a city that never completely sleeps. Frank closed his eyes and tried to picture the conversation he'd have with his co-workers back home, the questions he'd face from neighbors and friends, but those worries felt distant and unimportant. What mattered was Sarah's smile when she'd hugged him goodnight, the relief in her voice when he'd said her happiness was all that mattered. Frank Morrison had driven 800 miles to see his daughter's new house. He'd found much more than he'd bargained for, and much less than he'd feared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to get it right. Tonight, he was simply a father who loved his daughter, sleeping under the same roof as her for the first time in 15 years. Frank woke at 5:30 a.m., his internal clock still set to Ohio time. For a moment he forgot where he was, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the distant sound of highway traffic. Then the events of the previous evening came flooding back. The drive, the discovery, the conversation that had changed everything. He lay in bed for another 30 minutes, listening to the house wake up around him. Sarah and Jessica's voices drifted through the walls, quiet, domestic sounds of a couple starting their day together. He heard the shower running, coffee being made, the muffled noise of a morning news program. When Frank finally emerged from the guest room, he found Jessica alone in the kitchen, dressed in scrubs and eating toast while checking her phone. She looked up when he entered, offering a tentative smile. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. Coffee's fresh. Sarah made it before she left for work." "Sarah's already gone." Frank glanced at his watch. 7:15 a.m. "She has an early meeting with clients from California. Video conference at 7. She said to tell you she'll be home around 6 tonight." Jessica paused, studying his face. "She also said you're welcome to stay as long as you'd like." Frank poured himself coffee from the pot, noting that Sarah had remembered how he liked it, black, strong enough to float a nail. "What about you? Don't you have work?" "I'm a nurse at Austin Regional. I work 3 12-hour shifts a week, Wednesday through Friday, so I'm off today." She gestured to the scrubs. "These are just comfortable." They stood in the kitchen together, the morning sunlight streaming through windows that looked out onto a small backyard with a vegetable garden and a wooden deck. The silence wasn't exactly comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. "Sarah talks about you a lot," Jessica said finally. Frank raised an eyebrow. "I find that hard to believe, considering we barely spoke for the past 2 years. She does, though. She tells stories about when she was little, how you taught her to change a tire, how you built her a treehouse in the backyard, how you used to take her fishing at some lake in Ohio. Buckeye Lake," Frank said automatically. "We went every summer until she turned 16 and decided fishing was boring." Jessica smiled. "She said you were patient with her, even when she got frustrated because she couldn't cast the line right." Frank had forgotten about those fishing trips, about Sarah's determination to learn everything he tried to teach her. She'd been maybe 8 or 9, all elbows and knees and fierce concentration as she practiced casting until her little arms ached. "She was a good kid," Frank said quietly. "Stubborn, but good. She still is. Stubborn, I mean. And good." Jessica finished her toast and rinsed her plate in the sink. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" Frank nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the question. "Sarah was so scared to tell you about us. Not just because you might disapprove, but because she was afraid you'd disappear from her life completely. She said you'd already grown so distant after her mother died." The observation stung, because it was true. I didn't know how to be around her without Margaret. My wife was the translator between Sarah and me. She made sure we understood each other. But you're here now. "I am." "Why? I mean, Sarah called and asked you to visit, but something tells me you would have found a reason to stay home 6 months ago." Frank considered the question, surprised by Jessica's directness, because she sounded different on the phone. Scared, maybe, or lonely. I realized I hadn't heard her voice, really heard it, in months. Jessica nodded as if his answer made sense. "She misses you, you know. She misses having a father." "She has one." "Does she?" Because from where I sit, it looks like you both gave up on each other when Margaret died." The words were harsh, but not unkind. Jessica's tone was matter-of-fact, like a nurse delivering a difficult diagnosis. Frank set down his coffee mug harder than necessary. "I didn't give up on her." "Then why has she been dreading your reaction to our relationship for 3 years? Why did she buy a house and get promoted and build a whole life without sharing any of it with you?" "Because—" Frank started, then stopped. The honest answer was painful. "Because I didn't know how to be her father without her mother." Jessica's expression softened. "Mr. Morrison?" "Frank, please." "Frank, Sarah doesn't need you to be Margaret. She just needs you to be her dad." Before Frank could respond, Jessica's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and frowned. "I need to run to the store. Sarah wanted me to get ingredients for lasagna. Apparently it's your favorite." She grabbed her keys from the counter. "Would you like to come with me? I could show you around the neighborhood." Frank almost declined out of habit. He wasn't comfortable with small talk or social situations, but something in Jessica's manner reminded him of Margaret. Direct but kind, assuming the best rather than the worst. "All right," he said, "let me get my jacket." Austin in October was nothing like Ohio. The temperature was already in the 70s, and the trees were still green rather than the brilliant oranges and reds Frank was used to. Jessica drove them through Tarrytown in a white Honda CR-V that smelled faintly of vanilla and coffee. "Sarah said you were an electrician," Jessica said, as they passed a row of shops and restaurants on West Lynn Street. 35 years, mostly residential work, some commercial. I retired last year." "Do you miss it?" Frank considered the question. "I miss the work. I don't miss the early mornings or the hot attics in summer." "What do you do with your time now?" "Read, watch TV, work in my garden." It sounded pathetic when he said it out loud, the life of a man marking time rather than living. Jessica pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store called Central Market. "Sarah says you're good with your hands, that you built most of the furniture in your house." "Some of it. My father taught me basic carpentry, said a man should know how to fix things." "Sarah wishes you'd taught her more of that stuff." Frank looked at Jessica in surprise. She never seemed interested. She was always more focused on books, school, getting into college. Maybe she thought you didn't want to teach her. Maybe she thought those were things fathers did with sons, not daughters. They spent the next hour shopping for dinner ingredients, Jessica asking his opinion on everything from pasta brands to the type of cheese that would work best in the lasagna. Frank found himself relaxing despite his nervousness about the situation. Jessica was easy to talk to, unpretentious, despite her obvious education and success. "How did you and Sarah meet?" Frank asked as they waited in the checkout line. Jessica smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "At a conference in Dallas. I was presenting a paper on pediatric nursing protocols, and she was there with her tech company, demonstrating some kind of software for hospitals. We ended up at the same hotel bar after the first day." And she was arguing with the bartender about whether a Manhattan should be made with rye or bourbon whiskey, very passionately. I thought she was either really drunk or really opinionated. Frank could picture it perfectly. Sarah had inherited his stubborn streak and Margaret's willingness to debate anything. Which was it? Opinionated. She'd had exactly 1 beer. Jessica's smile widened. "I bought her a proper Manhattan made with rye, and we talked until the bar closed. She told me she was from Ohio, that her dad had taught her to appreciate good whiskey." Frank felt a flush of pleasure. He had taught Sarah about whiskey, spending Saturday evenings during her college years, explaining the differences between various brands and regions. It was one of the few things they'd shared without Margaret as intermediary. "She never mentioned that," Frank said. She probably didn't think you'd want to hear about her personal life. They drove home through neighborhoods that looked like something from a magazine, tree-lined streets with houses that had character and history, unlike the suburban developments Frank was used to. Jessica pointed out local landmarks, the elementary school where she volunteered, the veterinary clinic where they took their dog, the coffee shop where Sarah liked to work on weekends. "Wait," Frank said. "You have a dog?" Jessica looked embarrassed. "We do. Charlie. He's at doggy daycare today because Sarah thought, well, she wasn't sure how you'd react to finding out we have a dog together." "A dog is a pretty big commitment." "It is. We got him about a year ago. Sarah saw him at the shelter and fell in love." Jessica pulled into their driveway. "She was worried you'd see it as too domestic, too much like we're really together." Frank understood the implication. A dog wasn't just a pet. It was a shared responsibility, a sign of permanence and commitment. Sarah had been afraid he'd see it as confirmation that her relationship with Jessica was serious and long-term, which Frank was beginning to understand. It clearly was. Back at the house, Jessica showed him around more thoroughly than Sarah had the night before. The master bedroom with its king-size bed and shared closet space. The home office where Sarah worked remotely, with 2 desks positioned at right angles so both women could use the space. The guest bathroom stocked with both women's toiletries. This wasn't a roommate situation or a casual relationship. This was a life built together, complete with shared responsibilities, combined finances, and future plans. "Frank," Jessica said as they stood in the living room, "can I ask you something personal?" He nodded, though he was beginning to dread these conversations. "Are you really okay with this? With Sarah and me? Because if you're not, if you need time to process or if you have reservations, I'd rather know now." Frank looked around the house at the photos of Sarah and Jessica together, the carefully chosen furniture that reflected both their tastes, the small details that spoke of shared meals and quiet evenings and inside jokes. "Jessica, I'll be honest with you. This isn't what I expected or what I would have chosen for Sarah. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because it's not the life I imagined for her." Jessica's face went carefully neutral, preparing for rejection. "But," Frank continued, "what I imagine doesn't matter. What matters is that Sarah is happy, and she clearly is. What matters is that she's found someone who loves her and takes care of her. And from what I can see, that's you." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for saying that." "I'm not done." Frank sat down on the couch, gesturing for Jessica to do the same. "I want you to know that I'm not some backwards bigot who's going to make Sarah choose between her family and her happiness. But I also need you to understand that this is new for me. I'm going to need time to adjust, to learn how to be part of your lives." "What do you need from us?" "Patience and honesty. Don't hide things from me because you think I can't handle them. Don't edit your lives to make me more comfortable. If we're going to be family, then let's be family." Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Sarah is going to be so relieved. She's been terrified of this conversation for years. "Why didn't she just tell me sooner?" "Because she loves you, and she was afraid of losing you. She'd rather have you at arm's length than not at all." Frank thought about the distance he'd maintained since Margaret's death, the way he'd let fear and grief drive a wedge between him and his daughter. "I haven't been much of a father lately. You're here now. That's what matters." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing dinner together. Jessica taught Frank how to make her grandmother's lasagna recipe with layers of pasta and meat sauce and 3 different kinds of cheese. Frank found himself enjoying the process, the careful seasoning of the sauce, the precise layering of ingredients, the satisfaction of creating something from scratch. Sarah doesn't cook much, Jessica said, as they assembled the lasagna. She says she never learned because Margaret did all the cooking when she was growing up. Margaret loved to cook. She said it was how she showed love. Frank paused in his stirring. Maybe I should have taught Sarah some of those recipes. It's not too late. As the lasagna baked, they sat on the back deck with glasses of iced tea, watching the sun move across the small backyard. Frank asked Jessica about her work, her family, her interests outside of nursing. She told him about growing up in California as the daughter of a Taiwanese mother and Irish-American father, about putting herself through nursing school, about her volunteer work with refugee families. "What made you choose pediatric nursing?" Frank asked. "Kids don't lie about how they feel. If they're hurt, they tell you. If they're scared, they show it. Adults are more complicated. They pretend they're fine when they're not, or they exaggerate small problems into big ones. Kids are just honest." Frank thought about Sarah as a child, how she'd worn her emotions on her sleeve until adolescence taught her to hide them. Sarah used to be like that, honest about her feelings. She still is, once you get past her defenses. She just learned to protect herself. From me? Jessica considered her answer carefully. From disappointment, from judgment, from the possibility that the people she loves might not love her back unconditionally. The observation stung because Frank recognized the truth in it. He thought about all the times he'd held back his emotions, all the moments when he'd chosen silence over vulnerability. He'd taught his daughter to protect herself by example, and now he was surprised that she did. At 6 o'clock, Sarah's Honda Accord pulled into the driveway. Frank watched through the kitchen window as she got out of the car, checking her reflection in the side mirror and taking a deep breath before walking to the front door. She was nervous, Frank realized. Nervous about how the day had gone, about what she might find when she came home. "Honey, I'm back," Sarah called as she entered the house. "How did everything go?" Frank and Jessica exchanged a look, a moment of understanding that felt like the beginning of something important. "Fine," Frank called back. "Come see what we made for dinner." Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her work clothes, a navy blue blazer and slacks that made her look professional and confident. But her eyes held the uncertainty of a child hoping for approval. "You cooked together?" she asked, looking between Frank and Jessica. "Your father is an excellent sous chef," Jessica said. "He's got good knife skills." Sarah's face broke into the first completely relaxed smile Frank had seen from her since he'd arrived. "Dad always was good in the kitchen. Mom used to say he could fix anything, electrical problems, broken furniture, or a disappointing meal." Frank felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. Sarah was talking about him the way she used to when Margaret was alive, with affection instead of careful distance. "How was your day?" Frank asked. Sarah hung her blazer on the back of a chair and began setting the table. "Good, busy. The California clients approved our software proposal, so we'll be implementing it in 3 hospitals out there." She paused. "How was your day? Jessica didn't scare you off?" "Not yet," Frank said, earning a laugh from both women. As they sat down to dinner, Frank noticed details he'd missed the night before. The way Sarah and Jessica moved around each other with practiced ease. The way they shared food without asking, finished each other's sentences, communicated with glances across the table. It was the kind of comfortable intimacy that took years to develop. "This lasagna is incredible," Sarah said after her first bite. "Where did you learn to make it like this?" "Your father helped," Jessica said. "Turns out he's been holding out on us. He's actually a pretty good cook." Sarah looked at Frank with surprise. "I didn't know you cooked." "Your mother did most of it, but I learned a few things over the years." "You should teach me," Sarah said impulsively, then looked embarrassed by her own eagerness. "I'd like that," Frank said, meaning it. After dinner, they moved to the living room with glasses of wine, a bottle that Jessica had been saving for a special occasion. Frank sat in an armchair while Sarah and Jessica shared the couch, Jessica's feet tucked under Sarah's legs in a gesture so natural and unconscious that Frank realized they must sit like this every evening. "Dad," Sarah said, swirling her wine nervously, "I know yesterday was a lot to process. Are you really okay with everything?" Frank looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She was 33 years old, successful, clearly loved and loving. She'd built a life that was full and meaningful and honest, but she was still seeking his approval, like a child showing off a drawing from school. "Sarah, I've been thinking about something all day. Do you remember when you were about 10 and you wanted to learn how to drive the tractor at your Uncle Bill's farm?" Sarah smiled. "You said I was too young and it was too dangerous. And you spent the entire summer pestering me about it. Every time we visited Bill, you'd ask again. I was very persistent." "You were stubborn as a mule," Frank said, but his tone was affectionate. "Finally, I gave in and let you try. Do you remember what happened? I drove straight into Uncle Bill's fence and knocked down 3 posts. And what did I do?" Sarah's smile widened. "You helped me fix the fence, and then you let me drive the tractor again. Why do you think I did that? Because you wanted me to learn from my mistakes?" Frank shook his head. "Because I realized that watching you fail was less important than watching you try. You were going to find a way to drive that tractor with or without my permission. I could either be part of the experience or miss it entirely." Sarah set down her wine glass, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I feel the same way now," Frank continued. "You've built this life, this relationship, this happiness. You did it without my input or approval because you knew what you needed. I can either be part of it or miss it entirely." Jessica reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "I choose to be part of it," Frank said firmly. "If you'll have me." Sarah wiped her eyes with her free hand. "Of course we'll have you. We've wanted you to be part of it for so long." "Then I need to ask you both something," Frank said. "No more walking on eggshells around me. No more hiding parts of your lives because you're worried about my reaction. If we're going to do this, let's do it honestly." "Okay," Sarah said, though she still looked nervous. "What do you want to know?" Frank thought about all the questions that had been building up since he'd arrived. Everything. How you met, how you fell in love, what your plans are. "I want to know about your dog, your friends, your daily routines. I want to know what makes you both happy and what keeps you up at night worrying." Sarah and Jessica exchanged a look that seemed to contain an entire conversation. "Well," Jessica said, "if you really want to know everything, we should probably start with Charlie." "The dog?" "The dog who's currently at doggy daycare because we weren't sure how you'd react to finding out we have a furry child together," Sarah said, laughing despite her tears. Frank found himself smiling. "When do I get to meet this furry child?" "Jessica can pick him up tomorrow morning," Sarah said. "Fair warning, though. He's big, he's energetic, and he thinks he's a lapdog." "What kind of dog?" "German Shepherd mix," Jessica said. "We think there's some lab in there, too. He was a rescue. Someone found him as a puppy, wandering around East Austin with no collar or tags. And you fell in love with him." "Sarah fell in love with him," Jessica corrected. "I was the voice of reason, pointing out that we worked long hours and lived in an apartment and had no experience with dogs." "And what changed your mind?" "He chose us," Sarah said simply. "At the shelter, there were dozens of dogs barking and jumping and trying to get attention. Charlie just sat in his kennel and looked at us like he was waiting for us to figure out what he already knew." Frank could picture it, his daughter's soft heart winning out over practical considerations. Margaret had been the same way, bringing home stray cats and injured birds, despite Frank's protests. So you adopted him? We fostered him first, Jessica said, just for 2 weeks while the shelter looked for his owner, but no one claimed him, and by then he was already sleeping on our bed and had his own toy basket, Sarah finished. Jessica lasted exactly 4 days before she was more attached to him than I was. Frank watched the easy way they shared the story, finishing each other's sentences and smiling at shared memories. This wasn't a casual relationship or a phase Sarah was going through. This was a partnership built on love, trust, and shared commitment. Tell me about your friends, Frank said. Do you have couple friends, people you spend time with? We do, Sarah said. There's Marcus and David. They live 2 streets over. Marcus is a chef and David's a teacher. We have dinner with them once a week, usually. And there's Elena and her daughter Sophia, Jessica added. Elena's a single mum, works at the hospital with me. Sophia's 8 and thinks Sarah hung the moon. Sarah's good with kids. She's great with kids, Jessica said. She volunteers at the children's hospital sometimes, helping set up computer labs and teaching coding classes. Frank felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. His daughter had found ways to make a difference, to contribute to her community. She'd built a life that had meaning beyond just her own happiness. What about the future? Frank asked. Do you have plans? Sarah and Jessica exchanged another look, this one more tentative. We've talked about marriage, Sarah said quietly. When it became legal in Texas, we discussed it. And we decided we wanted to wait, Jessica said, until Sarah felt like she could include her family in the celebration. We didn't want to get married with important people missing. Frank felt the weight of that statement settle over him. His daughter had put her own wedding plans on hold because she was afraid he wouldn't accept them. She'd denied herself that milestone because she'd rather wait indefinitely than celebrate without him. I see, Frank said quietly. The room fell silent, except for the sound of the air conditioning cycling on and the distant hum of evening traffic. Dad? Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. Frank looked up at both women, his daughter and the woman she loved, both watching him with expressions of hope and fear. When you do decide to get married, Frank said carefully, I'd like to be there, if you'll have me. Sarah let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Really? Really? In fact, I'd be honored to walk you down the aisle if that's something you'd want. Now Sarah was crying openly, and Jessica wasn't far behind. Frank felt his own eyes getting misty and cleared his throat roughly. There's one condition, though, he said. Sarah wiped her eyes. What? I want to meet Charlie first. Got to make sure he's good enough for my daughter. The tension in the room broke like a dam, and suddenly all 3 of them were laughing and crying at the same time. Sarah jumped up from the couch and threw her arms around Frank, hugging him tightly. I love you, Dad, she whispered. I've missed you so much. Frank held his daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, like he might actually know how to be her father again. I love you too, sweetheart. And I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how to show it. When Sarah finally pulled back, Jessica was watching them, with tears streaming down her face. Jessica, Frank said, come here. She looked surprised, but approached hesitantly. Frank stood up and opened his arms. If you're going to be part of this family, we might as well make it official. Jessica stepped into the hug, and Frank wrapped his arms around both women, his daughter and the woman who made her happy. Welcome to the family, he said quietly, such as it is. Later that evening, after they'd finished the wine and talked until nearly midnight, Frank lay in the guest room thinking about the day. He thought about Margaret and what she would have said about Sarah and Jessica. He thought about the life his daughter had built, full of love and purpose and joy. He thought about the 800 miles he'd driven to get here, and how those miles had somehow become a bridge between the man he'd been and the father he wanted to become. Tomorrow he'd meet Charlie the dog. Tomorrow he'd learn more about Sarah's work, her friends, her daily life. Tomorrow he'd figure out how to be part of a family that looked nothing like the one he'd imagined, but everything like the one his daughter deserved. Outside his window, Austin continued its nighttime rhythm. But inside this house in Tarrytown, Frank Morrison was finally home. Frank woke to the sound of excited barking and Jessica's voice saying, "Charlie, calm down. I know you smell bacon, but you need to wait your turn." He checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. Back in Ohio, he would have been up for 2 hours already, but the combination of emotional exhaustion and wine had kept him sleeping later than usual. When he emerged from the guest room, he found chaos in the kitchen. A massive German Shepherd mix with floppy ears and intelligent brown eyes was dancing around Jessica's legs while she tried to cook breakfast. The dog noticed Frank immediately and bounded over, tail wagging so hard his entire back end wiggled. "You must be Charlie," Frank said, automatically extending his hand for the dog to sniff. Charlie bypassed the polite introduction entirely and planted his front paws on Frank's chest, trying to lick his face. "Charlie, down," Jessica commanded, but she was laughing. "Sorry, he has no concept of personal space. Sarah spoiled him completely." Frank scratched behind Charlie's ears, noting the dog's solid build and the alert intelligence in his eyes. "He's a handsome fellow." "How old?" "The vet thinks about 3 years. He was probably abandoned as a puppy." Jessica flipped bacon in the pan. "Coffee's fresh. Sarah's already gone again. Early client call with Seattle this time." Frank poured coffee and watched Charlie settle at his feet, resting his massive head on Frank's shoes. "He's friendly. Too friendly, according to our neighbors. He thinks everyone who walks past the house is coming to visit him specifically." Jessica plated the bacon and started scrambling eggs. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months." Frank was surprised to realize it was true. Despite the emotional upheaval of the past 2 days, he'd slept deeply and dreamlessly. "Sarah said you were having trouble sleeping after Margaret died." Frank stiffened slightly. He wasn't used to discussing personal matters with relative strangers, but Jessica's tone was matter of fact rather than prying. "Some nights are harder than others," he admitted. "That's normal. Grief affects everyone differently." Jessica brought plates to the table. "In my experience, it gets easier when you have something to look forward to rather than just things to remember." They ate breakfast, while Charlie positioned himself strategically between their chairs, hoping for dropped bacon. Frank found himself relaxing into the domestic routine, sharing the newspaper with Jessica, refilling coffee cups, discussing the weather and local news. "Frank," Jessica said as they cleared the dishes, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, though these conversations still made him nervous. "Sarah mentioned that you haven't been back to Ohio since you retired. Is there a reason you stayed away so long?" Frank considered the question while rinsing plates. "After Margaret died, I couldn't figure out how to be around Sarah without her mother there to translate between us. And the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to reach out." "What do you mean, translate?" Frank dried his hands on a dish towel, choosing his words carefully. "Margaret understood both of us. She knew when Sarah needed space and when she needed reassurance. She knew when I was worried about something but didn't know how to express it. Without her, Sarah and I just missed each other." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "Sarah said the same thing, that she never learned how to talk to you directly because Margaret always did it for her. Maybe that was our mistake, relying on someone else to maintain our relationship. Maybe. But you're both here now, trying to figure it out. That counts for something. Around noon, Sarah called to check in, and Jessica put her on speaker while they sat on the back deck with Charlie sprawled across both their feet. "How's everyone getting along?" Sarah asked, and Frank could hear the underlying anxiety in her voice. "Your father and Charlie have bonded," Jessica reported. "I think there might be some competition for who loves you more." Frank smiled, scratching Charlie's ears. "The dog's got good taste." "Dad?" Sarah's voice was softer now. "I was thinking, would you like to see where I work? I could give you a tour this afternoon if you're interested." Frank was touched by the invitation. Sarah had never shown interest in sharing her professional life with him before. "I'd like that very much." "Great. I'll text you the address. It's about 15 minutes from the house." After lunch, Frank drove Jessica's Honda to Sarah's office building in downtown Austin. The tech company occupied 3 floors of a modern glass tower with views of the Colorado River and the Austin skyline. Sarah met him in the lobby, dressed in jeans and a company t-shirt, looking younger and more relaxed than she had during her corporate years in Ohio. "Welcome to Innovate Tech," she said, leading him to the elevators. "We develop software solutions for healthcare systems." Frank had only a vague understanding of what Sarah did for work, something involving computers and hospitals. But as she walked him through the offices, her passion became evident. She introduced him to co-workers as "my dad" without hesitation, explaining projects and showing him demonstrations of software that could track patient data, manage hospital inventories, and improve communication between doctors and nurses. "This is impressive," Frank said, watching Sarah navigate complex computer screens with the same confidence he felt wiring electrical panels. "You built all this?" "Not alone. I have a great team." Sarah gestured to a conference room where several people were gathered around laptops and whiteboards covered with diagrams. "That's the California project team. We're implementing our patient management system in 3 hospitals. Frank watched his daughter interact with her colleagues, confident, respected, clearly good at what she did. She'd found her place in the world, built a career that made a difference in people's lives. "Mom would be proud," he said quietly. Sarah's face softened. "I hope so. I think about her sometimes when I'm working on projects that might help save lives. Like, maybe this is my way of being a healer, even though I'm not a doctor." They spent 2 hours at the office, Sarah explaining her work with genuine enthusiasm. Frank found himself understanding more than he'd expected. The logic behind system design reminded him of electrical circuits, with data flowing through pathways like current through wires. "You're good at this," Frank said as they walked back to the parking garage. "Thanks. It took me a while to find something I was passionate about, but I love solving problems and making systems work better." "Like your old man," Sarah smiled. "Yeah, I guess I did inherit some of your fix-it instincts." They drove back to Tarrytown in comfortable silence, the Austin traffic giving Frank time to process everything he'd seen. His daughter had built an impressive life. Professional success, a loving relationship, a home, a community. She'd done it all without his guidance or support, which made him proud and sad in equal measure. "Sarah," he said as they pulled into the driveway, "I owe you an apology." She turned off the engine and looked at him questioningly. "I should have been more involved in your life after college. I should have visited, asked questions, shown interest in your career and your happiness. I let my own discomfort keep me from being the father you deserved." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, you did the best you could with what you knew at the time. We both did. That doesn't make it right." "No, but it makes it human." Sarah unclipped her seatbelt and turned to face him. "The important thing is that you're here now, that you're trying." That evening, the 3 of them cooked dinner together, Frank's famous chili recipe that he'd learned from his own father. Sarah chopped vegetables with the focused concentration she'd inherited from him, while Jessica contributed cornbread and stories about her co-workers at the hospital. "There's something I want to ask you both," Frank said as they sat down to eat, "but I'm not sure how to bring it up." Sarah and Jessica exchanged a glance. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Your neighbors, the ones I'm supposed to pretend not to be related to. What's that about?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. "It's not all the neighbors. Just some of them can be judgmental about people who are different." "Different how?" "LGBTQ couples, interracial relationships, people who don't fit their idea of traditional families." Jessica's voice was matter-of-fact, but Frank caught the underlying tension. "Has someone said something to you?" "Not directly," Sarah said, "but there have been incidents, side comments, looks. The couple across the street made a point of mentioning their church's family values when we first moved in." Frank felt a familiar surge of protectiveness, the same feeling he'd had when Sarah was bullied in middle school for being too tall and too smart for her own good. "And you thought I'd make it worse. I thought you might not understand why we have to be careful, why we can't just be ourselves everywhere we go." Frank had never considered that Sarah and Jessica might face discrimination or hostility because of their relationship. In his world, people minded their own business and treated their neighbors with basic courtesy. The idea that someone would judge his daughter based on who she loved made his blood pressure rise. "Has anyone been outright hostile?" "Not hostile exactly," Jessica said carefully, "but we've learned to read the signs. Some people are welcoming, others are polite but distant, and a few make their disapproval clear through body language and tone." "What about your friends here, Marcus and David?" "They're great," Sarah said. "Most of our friends are very supportive. It's really just a small minority of people who have problems with us." Frank absorbed this information, thinking about his own small town in Ohio, where everyone knew everyone else's business, but generally kept their opinions to themselves. "I still don't understand why you didn't want the neighbors to know I'm your father." Sarah fidgeted with her napkin. "Because I was afraid you'd say something that would confirm their worst assumptions about people like us, that our families don't accept us, that we're somehow broken or wrong." The honesty stung, but Frank recognized the logic behind Sarah's fear. "And now?" "Now I think I was underestimating you," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry about that. Don't apologize for protecting yourself. You had no way of knowing how I'd react." Frank reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with his own. "But from now on, I want people to know exactly who I am. I'm Sarah Morrison's father, and I'm proud of her and the life she's built." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Jessica smiled. "I have a feeling most people will think twice before taking up anything with you." After dinner, they walked Charlie through the neighborhood, Frank noting the well-maintained houses and manicured yards. Several neighbors were outside enjoying the cool evening air, and Frank made a point of introducing himself as Sarah's father whenever they encountered someone. The reactions were mixed, as Sarah had predicted. Most people were polite and welcoming, genuinely pleased to meet Sarah's family. A few were notably cooler, offering brief acknowledgements before hurrying along. One elderly man across the street watched them from his porch with obvious disapproval, but didn't approach. "That's Mr. Henderson," Jessica murmured as they passed. "He's the one who mentioned church family values." Frank glanced back at the man, who was still watching them with pursed lips and crossed arms. "Charming," Frank said dryly. When they returned home, Sarah seemed lighter somehow, walking with straighter shoulders and less tension around her eyes. "Thank you," she said to Frank as they unleashed Charlie in the backyard, "for not hiding who you are. Thank you for giving me the chance to figure out who that is." Later that evening, Frank called his friend Bob back in Ohio to check on his house and update him on the visit. "So, how's it going down there?" Bob asked. "Sarah showing you all the sights?" Frank hesitated, considering how much to share. Bob was a good friend, but he was also part of Frank's small-town world where certain topics simply weren't discussed. "It's going well. She's got a nice life here. Good job. Nice house. And any chance she'll move back home now that you're retired? Give you some grandkids to spoil?" Frank felt the familiar knot in his stomach. "Bob, Sarah's happy here. She's built a good life." "I'm sure she has, but Texas is so far away. Wouldn't it be nice to have family closer?" Frank thought about Sarah and Jessica's life together, about the community they'd built and the work they both loved. "Sometimes distance is necessary," Frank said carefully. "Sometimes people need space to become who they're meant to be, I suppose, though I can't imagine letting my kids move that far away if I had a choice." After he hung up, Frank sat on the guest room bed thinking about the conversation. Bob meant well, but his assumptions about Sarah's life and Frank's expectations highlighted the gap between Frank's old world and his new reality. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Dad, can I come in?" "Of course." Sarah entered wearing pajama pants and an oversized t-shirt, looking younger than her 33 years. "I wanted to thank you again for today, for coming to my office, for meeting my co-workers, for not hiding our relationship from the neighbors." "You don't need to thank me for being proud of you." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. "I know this is all new for you, Jessica and I, our life together. I know it's not what you imagined for me." "No, it's not," Frank admitted. "But that doesn't make it wrong. What did you imagine for me?" Frank considered the question. "Honestly, I thought you'd marry someone from Ohio, live within driving distance, give your mother and me grandchildren to spoil. A traditional life like the one your mother and I had. And now I think what I imagined was less important than what makes you happy." Frank looked at his daughter's face, noting the contentment that seemed to radiate from her. "You are happy, aren't you?" "Incredibly happy. Happier than I ever thought possible." "Then that's all that matters." Sarah was quiet for a moment, picking at the bedspread. "Dad, there's something else I want to tell you. Something we've been talking about." Frank felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" "Jessica and I have been discussing having children, through IVF or adoption. We want to start a family." Frank absorbed this information, realizing he hadn't considered the possibility of Sarah having children with Jessica. How would that work? "There are lots of options now. We could use a sperm donor, or adopt through an agency that works with same-sex couples. We're still researching and discussing it." Frank tried to picture Sarah as a mother, Jessica as a co-parent, himself as a grandfather to their children. "What does Jessica think?" "She's excited about it. She's great with kids, and she really wants to be a mom." Sarah paused. "We were wondering, if we do have children, would you want to be their grandfather? Really be their grandfather, not just tolerate them because they're mine?" The question caught Frank off guard. "Sarah, any child you have would be my grandchild. Of course I'd want to be their grandfather. Even if they have two mums instead of a mom and a dad." Frank looked at his daughter, this strong, successful, happy woman who had somehow grown up to be everything he'd hoped for and nothing he'd expected. "Especially then," he said firmly, "those kids will be lucky to have two parents who love them as much as you and Jessica love each other." Sarah's smile was radiant. "Really, really. And they'll have a grandfather who's learned that love comes in more forms than he ever imagined." Sarah hugged him tightly, and Frank held his daughter close, thinking about the future that was unfolding before them. Grandchildren who might call Jessica Mama Jess, and him Grandpa Frank. Birthday parties and bedtime stories and Christmas mornings in Austin instead of Ohio. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a life filled with love and possibility and hope. "I love you, Dad," Sarah whispered. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." After Sarah went to bed, Frank sat by the guest room window, looking out at the quiet street. Tomorrow he'd have to start thinking about going back to Ohio, to his empty house and solitary routine. But something fundamental had shifted during these 3 days in Austin. He'd found his daughter again, and in doing so, he'd found a version of himself he'd thought was lost forever. His phone buzzed with a text from Bob. "Hope everything's going well down there. Can't wait to hear all about Sarah's life when you get home." Frank stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Sarah's doing great. She's found someone who makes her very happy. I'll tell you all about it when I get back." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a start. Frank Morrison was learning that sometimes love required courage, the courage to see beyond your own expectations, to accept truths that challenged your assumptions, and to choose connection over comfort. Outside his window, Austin slept peacefully under a canopy of stars. Inside this house in Tarrytown, a family was healing, one honest conversation at a time. Frank's last morning in Austin began with Charlie jumping onto his bed at 6 a.m., apparently having decided that guest room rules no longer applied. Instead of being annoyed, Frank found himself laughing as 80 pounds of enthusiastic dog settled across his legs, tail wagging and tongue lolling out in a canine grin. "Good morning to you too, Charlie," Frank said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Through the thin walls, he could hear Sarah and Jessica getting ready for work, shower running, coffee maker gurgling, the familiar sounds of a household starting its day. When Frank emerged from the guest room, he found both women in the kitchen, dressed for their respective jobs, but moving with less urgency than the previous mornings. "Morning, Dad," Sarah said, handing him a cup of coffee, prepared exactly how he liked it. "How did you sleep?" "Until your dog decided I needed a wake-up call," Jessica laughed. "He's officially adopted you. He only does that to people he really likes." "Should I be honored or worried?" "Definitely honored," Sarah said. "Charlie's a good judge of character." They sat together at the kitchen table, sharing the newspaper and making small talk about the weather and local news. But Frank could sense an underlying tension, the awareness that this domestic routine was temporary, that in a few hours he'd be driving back to Ohio and their lives would return to phone calls and text messages. "What time do you want to leave?" Sarah asked, trying to sound casual. Frank glanced at his watch. "Probably around 10. That'll get me home before midnight if I don't hit traffic." "You could stay another day," Jessica offered. "Or longer. There's no rush." Frank was tempted, but he could see the uncertainty in both women's faces. They needed time to process the past 3 days, as much as he did. "I should get back. I've got a doctor's appointment Tuesday, and Bob's been checking on the house." Frank paused. "But I'd like to come back soon. Maybe for Thanksgiving?" Sarah's face lit up. "Really? You'd want to spend Thanksgiving here?" "If you'll have me. I've been eating frozen turkey dinners for 2 years. I think it's time for a real holiday." "We'd love that," Jessica said. "We usually volunteer at the homeless shelter in the morning, then have dinner with Marcus and David and a few other friends." Frank nodded, though the idea of spending Thanksgiving with strangers still made him nervous. "Sounds perfect." After breakfast, Sarah insisted on taking the morning off to see him off. The 3 of them spent an hour sitting on the back deck, watching Charlie chase squirrels and talking about plans for Frank's next visit. "There's something I want to give you before you go," Sarah said, disappearing into the house. She returned with a wrapped package about the size of a shoebox. Frank opened it carefully, revealing a framed photograph he'd never seen before. It showed him and Sarah from about 15 years ago, taken at one of their fishing trips to Buckeye Lake. Frank was helping Sarah cast her line, both of them focused intently on the water. In the background, Margaret could be seen setting up their picnic lunch, smiling at her husband and daughter. "I found this in Mum's photo albums after the funeral," Sarah explained. "I've had it on my desk at work ever since. But I thought you might like to have it." Frank traced the glass with his finger, remembering that day clearly. Sarah had been about 18, home from college for the summer. She'd been going through a difficult breakup and was questioning her major and her future. They'd spent the entire day on the lake, talking about everything and nothing, and by the end Sarah had seemed more like herself again. "I remember this day," Frank said quietly. "You caught your first base. You were so proud. You made Mum take about 20 pictures. I still have the photos somewhere." Frank looked up at Sarah. "Thank you for this. It's perfect." "Dad," Sarah said, settling back into her chair, "I want you to know that these past 3 days have meant everything to me. I've missed having a father, and I've missed the man you used to be before Mum died." Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "I missed him too. Do you think you might be able to find him again?" Frank looked around the deck, at Sarah curled up in her chair, at Jessica reading a book with Charlie at her feet, at the small garden they'd cultivated together. 3 days ago, this scene would have been unimaginable to him. Now it felt like a glimpse of the future he wanted to build. "I think I'm starting to," Frank said. At 10 o'clock, Frank loaded his overnight bag into the truck, while Sarah and Jessica stood in the driveway offering last-minute suggestions for the drive home. Charlie seemed to sense that something was happening and kept trying to climb into the passenger seat. "Drive carefully," Sarah said, hugging him tightly. "And call when you get home so we know you made it safely." "Text us if you need anything," Jessica added, surprising Frank with her own hug. "And remember, you're always welcome here." Frank climbed into the truck and rolled down the window. "Sarah, I want you to know something. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the life you've built, the woman you've become, and the choices you've made. I should have told you that years ago." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Both of you." As Frank drove through Austin's morning traffic, he caught glimpses of the city Sarah had chosen as home. Coffee shops and food trucks, the university campus where she'd gone to college, the Colorado River where she'd learned to kayak. It was vibrant and diverse and full of life, nothing like the small Ohio town where he'd raised her, but everything she needed to become herself. The drive home gave Frank 12 hours to think about the past 3 days and what they meant for his future. He thought about Sarah and Jessica's easy partnership, their obvious love and commitment to each other. He thought about their plans for children, about Charlie the dog who had claimed him as family, about the life they were building together. He also thought about his own life back in Ohio, the empty house, the silence that had become his constant companion, the way he'd been marking time rather than living it. Somewhere outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, Frank made a decision. He pulled over at a rest stop and called his realtor back in Ohio. "Hi, Janet, it's Frank Morrison. I need to ask you about selling my house." Frank had been thinking about downsizing since Margaret's death, but he'd never had the motivation to actually do it. Now, driving back from Austin with his heart full of new possibilities, the 4-bedroom house where he'd raised Sarah felt like a museum of memories rather than a home. "Are you thinking of moving somewhere smaller?" Janet asked. "I'm thinking of moving somewhere warmer," Frank said. "Maybe closer to my daughter." By the time Frank reached Ohio that night, he'd made preliminary plans to put his house on the market after the holidays. He'd start fresh somewhere new. Maybe not Austin, which might be too close for comfort, but somewhere in Texas where he could be part of Sarah and Jessica's lives without overwhelming them. His house felt even emptier than usual when he walked through the front door. The silence was oppressive after 3 days of conversation and laughter, and the constant background noise of Charlie's presence. Frank made himself a sandwich and sat at his kitchen table, looking at the photograph Sarah had given him. The man in that picture looked confident and engaged, fully present in the moment with his daughter. Frank wanted to be that man again. His phone rang at 11:30 p.m., Sarah calling to make sure he'd arrived safely. "How was the drive?" she asked. "Long but good. Gave me time to think." "About what?" Frank considered how much to share. "About changes I want to make, about the kind of father I want to be going forward." "Dad, you don't have to change anything. I love you exactly as you are." "I know, but I want to be better, for you, for Jessica, for myself." They talked for another 20 minutes, Sarah filling him in on her evening and Frank describing the route he'd taken home. It was the longest phone conversation they'd had in years, and it felt natural rather than forced. "Dad," Sarah said as they were preparing to hang up, "thank you for coming. Thank you for being open to everything. Thank you for accepting Jessica and our life together." "Thank you for trusting me with it," Frank replied. "I know that took courage." "I love you, Dad. Sleep well." "I love you too, sweetheart." The next few weeks fell into a new pattern. Frank and Sarah talked on the phone twice a week, real conversations about their daily lives, rather than stilted exchanges of basic information. Jessica joined the calls sometimes, sharing stories from the hospital or asking Frank's advice about home repair projects. Frank began making concrete plans for his move. He researched Texas cities within a few hours' drive of Austin, San Antonio, Houston, even smaller towns that might feel more familiar while still keeping him close to Sarah. He started sorting through 30 years of accumulated belongings, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The hardest part was going through Margaret's things, items he'd been unable to touch since her death. But now, with the prospect of a new beginning ahead of him, Frank found the strength to pack away her clothes for donation and carefully preserve the photographs, jewelry and mementos that Sarah might want someday. In a box of Margaret's papers, Frank found something that made him sit down hard on their bedroom floor. A letter addressed to him in Margaret's handwriting, with instructions not to open until after her death. With trembling hands, Frank opened the envelope. "My dearest Frank, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're trying to figure out how to live without me. I know how lost you must feel right now, how quiet the house must seem. I need you to know that the 30 years we had together were the happiest of my life. You were a wonderful husband and father, even when you doubted yourself. Sarah loves you more than you realize, but she needs you to show her that love in ways she can understand. Don't let my death be the end of your relationship with our daughter. She's going to need her father, especially as she navigates the challenges ahead. Be patient with her, Frank. Be present. Don't let pride or fear keep you from being part of her life. I know Sarah will find her own path, and it might not be the one we expected. But whatever choices she makes, whatever kind of life she builds, she'll need your support and acceptance. Promise me you'll give her that, even if you don't understand everything about her decisions. Take care of yourself, my love. Find reasons to be happy again. Don't just exist, live. Sarah needs to see that it's possible to build joy after loss. I'll be watching over both of you, proud of the man you are and the father you'll become. All my love, Margaret. Frank read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Margaret had known somehow that Sarah would need his acceptance for choices he didn't expect. She'd tried to prepare him to be the father their daughter would need. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Frank got a call that changed everything. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice filled with excitement. "Jessica and I have news." Frank's heart skipped. "What kind of news?" "We're pregnant." "Well, Jessica's pregnant. We just got the results from the fertility clinic." Frank sat down hard in his kitchen chair. Pregnant? Already? We've been trying for 6 months. We didn't want to say anything until we knew for sure it would work. Sarah was talking fast, the words tumbling out. The baby's due in July. We're having a baby, Dad. Frank felt a surge of emotion so strong it left him speechless. His daughter was going to be a mother. He was going to be a grandfather. Dad, are you there? Are you okay? I'm here, Frank managed. I'm going to be a grandfather. You are. Jessica's feeling great so far, no morning sickness yet. We have our first ultrasound next week. Frank thought about the future spreading out before them. A baby born into love, raised by 2 devoted parents, growing up knowing they were wanted and cherished. How are you feeling about it? Frank asked. Terrified and excited and happy all at once. We've wanted this for so long, and now it's actually happening. You're going to be wonderful mothers. Do you really think so? I know so. That baby is going to be so lucky to have you and Jessica as parents. After they hung up, Frank sat in his kitchen thinking about Margaret's letter, about Sarah's happiness, about the grandchild who would arrive next summer. He thought about the empty rooms in his Ohio house and the new life taking shape in Austin. He called Janet the realtor that afternoon. I want to accelerate the timeline, he told her. I want the house on the market by January 1st. That's pretty fast, Frank. Are you sure? I'm sure. My daughter's having a baby, and I want to be close enough to be a real grandfather, not just a voice on the phone. Thanksgiving in Austin exceeded Frank's expectations. He arrived Wednesday afternoon to find Sarah glowing with early pregnancy and Jessica fighting waves of morning sickness that had finally kicked in. The house was full of preparation and anticipation. Marcus and David coming for dinner, Elena bringing Sophia, other friends Sarah and Jessica had collected over their years in Austin. Are you sure you're okay with a crowd? Sarah asked as they prepared the turkey Thursday morning. I know you're more comfortable with small groups. Frank looked around the kitchen. Jessica teaching Sophia how to make cranberry sauce, Marcus and David debating football scores, Charlie weaving between everyone's legs, hoping for dropped food. 6 months ago, this scene would have overwhelmed him. Now, it felt like family. I'm fine, Frank said, and meant it. This is exactly how holidays should be. During dinner, Frank found himself telling stories about Sarah's childhood, sharing memories that made everyone laugh and brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Jessica's parents joined them via video call from California, welcoming Frank warmly and expressing their excitement about becoming grandparents together. So, Frank, Marcus said as they cleared the dinner dishes, Sarah tells us you're thinking about moving to Texas. Considering it. My daughter's having a baby, and I'd like to be close enough to help. Any idea where you're looking? Frank glanced at Sarah, who was watching him with barely contained hope. I was thinking somewhere within driving distance of Austin. Close enough to visit regularly, but not so close I'm in the way. Dad, Sarah said quietly, you could never be in the way. What about Dripping Springs? David suggested. It's about 30 minutes west of here. Still small-town feel, but close enough for regular visits. Frank had heard of Dripping Springs. Hill country, good fishing, the kind of place that might feel like home while still being close to his new life. I'll look into it, Frank said. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were done, Frank sat on the back deck with Sarah and Jessica, watching Charlie explore the yard in the darkness. Dad, Sarah said, there's something we want to ask you. Frank tensed slightly, still not completely comfortable with serious conversations. We were wondering, Jessica continued, if you'd like to be in the delivery room when the baby's born. Frank blinked in surprise. In the delivery room? If you want to be, Sarah said quickly. We know it's not traditional, But you're going to be this baby's only grandfather, and we want you to be part of everything from the beginning." Frank thought about the moment he'd first held Sarah, red-faced and screaming and absolutely perfect. Margaret had been exhausted but radiant, and Frank had felt like his heart might explode from the magnitude of love he felt for this tiny person. "I would be honored," Frank said quietly. "Really? Really? Though I should warn you, I cried like a baby when Sarah was born." Sarah laughed. "I'm planning to cry like a baby when this one's born too." On his last morning in Austin, Frank woke to find Charlie once again sprawled across his bed, but this time Sarah was sitting in the chair by the window, watching him with a soft smile. "Morning, Dad. Sorry about the early wake-up committee." Frank checked his watch. 7 a.m. "What are you doing up so early? Shouldn't pregnant women sleep in?" "Couldn't sleep. Too excited about everything." Sarah pulled her robe tighter around herself. "Dad, I want to tell you something before you leave." Frank sat up, suddenly alert. "What is it?" "6 months ago, I was afraid I'd lost you forever. I thought we'd grown so far apart after Mum died that we'd never find our way back to each other." Sarah's voice was soft but steady. "But these past few weeks, talking to you, having you here for Thanksgiving, knowing you're excited about the baby, it feels like I have my father back." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You never lost me, sweetheart. I just forgot how to show you that I was still here. I know that now, and I want you to know that whether you move to Texas or stay in Ohio, whether you're here for every doctor's appointment or just the big moments, you're going to be an amazing grandfather." "How can you be so sure?" Sarah smiled. "Because you were an amazing father. You just forgot for a while." Frank hugged his daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and marveling at how much had changed since that October morning when he'd driven 800 miles to see her new house. He'd come to Austin expecting to see where Sarah lived. Instead, he'd discovered who she'd become, and in the process, he'd remembered who he wanted to be. 3 months later, Frank Morrison sold his house in Ohio and moved to a small ranch-style home in Dripping Springs, Texas, 27 miles from his daughter's front door. His new house had a guest room ready for when the baby came to visit, a workshop where he could build toys and furniture, and a front porch where he could sit in the evenings and think about how much his life had changed. Sarah and Jessica visited every weekend, helping him settle in and sharing ultrasound photos and baby name ideas. Frank joined them for doctor's appointments and childbirth classes, learning alongside Jessica about what to expect during labor and delivery. On a hot July morning, Frank's phone rang at 4 a.m. with the call he'd been waiting for. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice tight with pain and excitement. "It's time. Jessica's in labor." Frank was at the hospital in 20 minutes, finding Sarah pacing the hallway while Jessica worked through contractions in their room. For the next 8 hours, Frank watched his daughter transform into a mother, coaching Jessica through pain, holding her hand during the hardest moments, radiating love and strength and fierce protectiveness. When Emma Margaret Morrison Chen finally made her appearance at 2:17 p.m., Frank was there to see his granddaughter take her first breath. She was perfect, tiny and pink and absolutely beautiful, with Sarah's dark hair and Jessica's determined chin. "Do you want to hold her, Grandpa?" Jessica asked, exhausted but glowing. Frank accepted the tiny bundle with trembling hands, looking down into dark eyes that seemed to look right back at him. Emma made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a comment on the strangeness of the world she'd just entered. "Hello, sweetheart," Frank whispered. "I'm your grandpa, and I've been waiting to meet you." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect, isn't she?" "Absolutely perfect," Frank agreed. 6 months later, Frank's life had a rhythm he never could have imagined. Emma stayed with him 2 mornings a week while Sarah worked from home and Jessica caught up on sleep between her hospital shifts. Frank had become an expert at diaper changes, bottle feeding, and the precise art of getting a baby to sleep in her crib rather than in someone's arms. His small house in Dripping Springs had become a second home for Sarah and Jessica, filled with baby gear and family photos and the sounds of laughter and love. Frank had joined a local church where people knew him as Emma's grandfather rather than the quiet widower from Ohio. He'd made new friends, learned to text message with reasonable proficiency, and discovered that he was capable of far more emotional growth than he'd believed possible. On Emma's 6-month birthday, the whole family gathered at Frank's house for a barbecue. Marcus and David drove out from Austin with Elena and Sophia. Jessica's parents flew in from California. Even Bob made the trip from Ohio, curious to meet Frank's new family and see how his old friend was faring in Texas. As the sun set over the hill country, Frank found himself on his front porch with Emma in his arms, surrounded by the sounds of family and friendship. Sarah sat beside him, Jessica on the other side, all of them watching their daughter discover her own feat with intense concentration. "Hard to believe this all started with you driving 800 miles to see my house," Sarah said. Frank thought about that October morning when he'd left Ohio with no idea what he'd find in Austin. He'd been a man running away from loneliness and loss, hoping to reconnect with a daughter who felt like a stranger. Now he was a grandfather, a Texan, a man with purpose and people who needed him. He'd learned that love could take forms he'd never imagined, that family could be built as well as born, and that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. "Best 800 miles I ever drove," Frank said, kissing the top of Emma's soft head. "Even though I told you not to tell the neighbors you were my father?" Frank chuckled. "Especially because of that, it forced us to be honest with each other." As stars began to appear in the clear Texas sky, 3 generations of the Morrison family sat together on the front porch, surrounded by love and laughter and the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. Frank Morrison had traveled 800 miles to see his daughter's new house and discovered something far more valuable. He'd found his way home,